There's even studies supporting how the baby, your newborns, will cry with an accent, with your accent. In other words, they've heard mama's speech, especially her nonverbal elements, right? The prosody elements, the rhythm to it, the intonation, the volume, all of that. And so they will match their cry to whatever the native language is. So I think that's pretty remarkable that learning begins in the womb, not even when you first hold your beautiful baby. Here's why I think all of this is so powerful.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Toddlers, where I share more than just tips and tricks on how to reduce tantrums or build your toddler's vocabulary. We're going to cover all of that, but here, our goal is to develop clarity, because in this modern world, it's truly overwhelming. This podcast is about empowering moms to know the difference between fact and fiction, to never give up, to tap into everyday activities so your child stays on track. He's not falling behind, he's thriving through your guidance. We know that true learning starts at home, so let's get started.
Every mom loves to hear her baby babble. Those sweet little coos, sighs, gurgles, they seem almost magical. But here's the thing, babbling isn't just a cute phase. It's an actual critical stage of development. And while you might think your baby's doing just fine, what if I told you that many new parents miss early signs of delay, not because they're not paying attention, but because they simply don't understand what babbling is and how best to support it? So in this episode, we're going deeper than just the milestone charts. We're unpacking what your baby's brain, body, and mouth are working on during that first year. We're going to take a good look at how movement, attention, feeding, and social connection all shape his or her ability to communicate. And by the end of today's conversation, you'll know more than just what it sounds like. You'll know why babbling matters. You'll know how babbling or how to support babbling, and most importantly, you'll know when to act. Because noisy babies, they're on the path of becoming a confident, chatty toddler. So welcome back to Talking Toddlers. And if you're new here, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Erin, your host. I'm a speech language pathologist, an early interventionist, and most importantly, your trusted guide in these early parenting years. If you've been tuning into this particular mini-series, you'll already know that we're diving deep into what quote-unquote normal development means and how to apply that to those developmental charts or milestones. Because it's much more than just checking off boxes. It's moving beyond that pressure that you're feeling. Am I good enough? Are they okay? Are they on track? What am I not seeing or what am I not understanding? And it's definitely beyond that oversimplified advice that you might get at your pediatrician's checkup. And no offense to my pediatric doctor colleagues, but their cursory understanding of development might be a little incomplete. And I know that you want to know more. I know that you want to stay ahead of it and really jump into that driver's seat and know how to navigate through these early years. So just as a recap, in episode 1, we explored how milestones are really a reference point. They're not rigid rules. They're not even set in stone per se, as we know that there's some mobility in there, some fluid zigging and zagging. But the key here is that they weren't really designed to measure progress. They were started back in 2004 actually just to start conversations. The design and the purpose of them is really to get your pediatrician, who doesn't really know all that much about specific development, but to help them start a conversation with you. And they weren't supposed to shame or make you feel like you're messing up or even scare you that like, oh my gosh, they don't have very many. What do I do? Right? Because what a pediatrician actually does is check off a few with you. And if you're not, quote unquote, hitting the mark, they just refer you out. So in episode 2, we zoomed in on specific milestones around movement because it's been in the conversational flow for the last couple of years because the CDC kind of took it upon themselves to remove a few and to expand some of the expectations. We don't all agree, but I wanted to give you some insight from my perspective and what the pediatric therapists are thinking about this. So in episode 2, we looked at how crawling, walking, squatting, climbing, all of those big motor movement really shape your baby's brain and his or her nervous system. So we're wiring his neurological networks, building them from the ground up, and then we're connecting them to his whole body, right? His torso, his upper motor neurons I talked a lot about, and lower motor neurons, the limbs, right? But in today's episode, we're going to bring it back together to focus on one of the most exciting signs of development, in my biased opinion, and that's babbling, right? Because babbling will move your child toward clear, articulated speech. And so I think that we rush through some of these early developmental stages because we don't really understand the importance that they're meant to help your child build the skills and build those networks, right? So let me start by clearing something up first. Words don't typically just appear one day, right? And first clear words. And when we talk about single words that a child will say over and over again, independently for purpose, right? To actually communicate or request or ask or confirm, right? But these first words come after months and months of building blocks that many parents don't really recognize. And the truth is, teachers, as I said, pediatricians, special educators even don't understand. Babbling is really the gateway to language. And language is how we string those words together to make phrases and sentences and conversation. Speech are those individual physical sounds that we make, right? The b is different than the g. And so babbling, being able to practice the sounds of their native language, and we'll talk about what all of that looks like, is really the gateway to the whole language processing, the speech and the speech sounds, the expressive language and the receptive language. And I just want to highlight someone who really made a difference, not only in my clinical practice, but in early child development and in language processing, right? A woman named Patricia Cool, and she's really a renowned neuroscientist. And I think she's still in the position of a co-director at the Institute of Learning and Brain Sciences at the University of Washington. But Dr. Cool really coined the phrase that babies are born, quote unquote, citizens of the world. And I've used that phrase thousands of times probably, and I'm sure you've heard me mention it here. What she means is that every single baby born in the whole world is born with the ability to distinguish, and distinguish just means to auditorily perceive and hear differences between the sounds of all languages. And I think that that's incredibly poignant, that we need to consider this, that every single newborn, whether they're in Africa or Chile or Canada, or if they're healthy, full-term, typical, healthy newborn, that they have the capacity to really distinguish all sounds of every culture. And it's somewhere between 6 and 12 months, typically around 8, we start really seeing a change, right? That somewhere around 8 months of age, they begin to specialize in the sounds of their native language, the language that they hear most often. And yes, you can teach a newborn or a baby or a toddler 2 or 3 languages as long as they're hearing all of those languages relatively equally. But Dr. Kuhl and her colleagues really conducted a whole battery of tests in the 1990s and then again in the early 2000s using head turn techniques. And then later on, as technology advanced in the 2000s, really started using MEG imaging and EEG imaging. Her research demonstrated that newborns can discriminate phonemes, and a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound that changes meaning. And I use these terms, not that you have to be tested or you have to understand them, but there's a lot of jargon in every field, right? But a phoneme is important because, and I know I've shared this with you all before, but there are 26 letter names in the alphabet in English, but there are 42 to 44, depending on where you speak English, phonemes, and phonemes are the different sounds that all those letters can make. And so a newborn can discriminate phonemes from all of the languages, not just their native language, right? Up until about 6, 7, 8 months of age. And then at that point, they start to prune or lose sensitivity to their non-native phonemes, while they then increase their sensitivity to their native language. And I remember in the 1990s when Dr. Kuhl and her team started really sharing their work with us. And we're like, wow, at 8 months of age, they really no longer perceive sounds that aren't in their native language. And it was poignant to me there in Southern California because some of the work was comparing English American babies with Chinese babies, and that the Chinese and the American English speaking babies could auditorily discriminate the R, and the L equally well up until about 8 months of age. And then the Chinese babies no longer could perceive or distinguish. They couldn't even perceive it, meaning they couldn't even hear it, or they weren't aware of it anymore because the R and the L aren't sounds, phonemes in Chinese. And so it was really a turning point in our field, right? Linguists and speech and language pathologists really zoning in on the auditory skills of newborns and within that first 6 months and 12 months. But what's happening in that first year is that it's really part of that whole neural commitment to being able to wire itself and focus in on the dominant language, because it's not important for, it's nice to be able to have 2 or 3 languages, but the whole idea is for you to build a relationship with your primary caretakers, right? And that's what makes us human. And it's part of our survival, yes, but it's also part of becoming human and wiring the verbal networks so then you can make sense and learn from the beautiful people that are taking care of you. So that's just a side note, but I think it's really fascinating to sometimes step back and look at what babies are capable of doing if we give them the environments to do it. And And if you want to hear more about this, Dr. Cool gave a TED Talk, and I think it was in 2010. And the title is The Linguistic Genius of Babies. And it's really where she introduces the phrase of citizens of the world. And I just think the way that she explains it to a lay audience, a wider audience, is really quite brilliant. And she's a great communicator herself. I'll have the link down below just in case you want to go there. But I think it's important that we accept and embrace the brilliance of how our beautiful babies are designed by God. I believe in God's purposeful design for us to grow and learn through this three-dimensional world with us as the guide, right? With us as the steward. So when we look at those early sounds, right, we get through those first 4 or 6 weeks, right, that babies really do start to coo with intention, that they're soft vowel sounds. You usually hear at 6 to 8 weeks of age, right, within those first couple of months, that they've migrated from these undifferentiated cries to more purposeful, differentiated cries. You are learning about them and they are learning about you. And then you'll hear a lot of glottal sounds, right? That's in the back of the throat, and vowel sounds, right? They're single, like ah, ha, right? Ooh. And they're learning how to make movements on purpose, blow some bubbles, do some of those coos, gurgles, a lot of sighing. And they really begin to imitate us because in those first 6 to 8 weeks, those first couple of months, we imitate them first. And then they're like, oh, wow, I can have this two-way conversational flow with this beautiful person that's taking care of me, right? But somewhere around 4 to 6 months, they start experimenting with consonants and vowels, right? So those first 3 to 4 months is really just vowel sounds, because the only thing that they really or the first thing that they begin to master motorically in their mouth is that jaw and their lips. And so they'll go, ah, ooh, ee. And so then 4 to 6 months, consonant sounds. You'll hear ba, 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 da, 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 ma, ma, ma. Those are the easiest. And it's pretty universal in most cultures that the b and the d and the will start to emerge. Those are the easiest sounds for us as humans to make. That's where da da or mama, papa all came from, right? But that's initial babbling. But the vowel sound is usually the same in that short little syllable there, that consonant vowel. And so you'll be, and I'm sure you've seen it online if you haven't already experienced it, but it's really purposeful, rehearsed communication. They're playing with their voice and their articulators to try to share with you. And it's your baby working out how to control their lips and their tongue and their jaw and their breath. And that goes back to why tummy time is so important. But that's what we call oral motor development. It's looking at the cooing and the babbling. It's looking at that share taking, right? That turn taking and sharing of just noises, right? It's a huge part of communication that ties directly back, as I said, into episode 2 about movement, right? And that's why tummy time and being free on the ground to be able to move their body in space is really allowing them to then focus and hone in on a lot of these small, fine articulators in their mouth, right? Here's where I think we can really overlooked, that babbling is progression and that it evolves and as a speech therapist, I can certainly get into the weeds of looking at the progressive steps. But I want most people, especially new moms and new dads and new grandparents, I wish other allied health professionals would, but I want them to be able to hear and see the difference, right? When they move from cooing, which are just vowel-like sounds, to initial babbling. So the first one would be repeated syllables of the same syllable, and we call it canonical, right? It's the same. And then they move toward more complex forms, variegated ones. And that's where they change the consonants, and then they can change the consonant and the vowel. So they need to mix it up, like ba-di-ga, goo ga boo, boo bee, boo bee. Yeah, and so they're really trying to play with the consonants and the vowels. That takes a lot more fine oral motor movement, right? But when they start to add differentiated consonants and vowel shapes, we call them shapes, right? It's really recognizing that I can stabilize my body, stabilize my head, and just move my jaw, my lips, my tongue, even my palate, right? So we have a hard palate if we run our tongue on the roof of our mouth, and then we have that soft palate. And we hope to close off that soft palate when we're drinking because we don't want liquid to go up our nose, right? Well, we have some nose sounds, right? So is a nose sound. And we can go mum, 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 mum. But if I plug my nose, and for you watching the video, you'll see I'll plug my nose and it'll sound closed off, right? Mum, 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 right? But if I do the same with ba, 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 that's a B, not an M, ba, 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 it doesn't change. So just that fine motor control of the soft palate to close it off. And where am I going to push the air out of my mouth or out of my nose, right? And so they've learned how to coordinate that, not on a conscious level, but through all of their sucking and swallowing patterns. And then as they move into that 6th month and you're introducing solids to them, now they're doing it with chewing and biting and swallowing. So again, the oral motor planning comes from speech sounds and noise making as well as eating. And then we need to kind of look at the same time as they're experimenting with all of these sounds with co-articulation, they're also experimenting with what we call the nonverbal side, right? The intonation and the pitch and the volume and the rhythm. So you want a lot of variety. You want to hear them do it with themselves, right? Vocal play, talking to themselves, and with others. And so those nonverbal elements to the intonation, the pitch, the volume, the rhythm of it, that's what we call prosody. And it really is the music quality of speech. And the prosody for English is going to be different than German, which will be different than French, right? And there's even studies, and this is another rabbit hole we can get into, but there's even studies supporting how the baby, your newborns, will cry with an accent, with your accent. In other words, they've heard mama's speech, especially her nonverbal elements, right? The prosody elements, the rhythm to it, the intonation, the volume, all of that. And so they will match their cry to whatever the native language is. So I think that's pretty remarkable that learning begins in the womb, not even when you first hold your beautiful baby. But here's why I think all of this is so powerful. It shows up across cultures and languages and geography across the world, right? And so let's talk about 4 very specific elements to this, the cooing and the early babbling, and how verbal and nonverbal elements to it fit together. So the first is that babies are born with this rhythm sensitivity, right? And like I just said, that it starts, or we've been able to identify it, that it will begin to really develop in that third trimester, right? That babies begin to hear and respond to the rhythm of their native language, right? Especially the moms, because that's what they hear the clearest. And so, yes, they can hear loud noises from the outside, but it's not even remotely the same as what mama's voice is. And all of that, how should I say it? All of that malarkey, like music with Mozart and all of that stuff is not, the science doesn't support that at all. So, and that's another conversation. But the interesting thing is that across the cultures during this period, we've also noticed that sing-songy or mother's ease or parent ease, we've now changed the title that we call it because men do it too, and older children do it. But that's that sing-songy, exaggerated, a slower tempo, a higher pitch even, that comes naturally to us, the grown-ups and the older children. And that's where we build nursery rhymes on that whole concept. And nursery rhymes are truly cultural as well. So it supports the rhythm of the language, right? And babies are born with that rhythm. Again, if it's a healthy pregnancy and unremarkable, I love that word for births, that they're unremarkable. Everything went as planned without a hitch, right? But nursery rhymes are also really memory friendly. And so they're building your baby and toddler's auditory skills, right? Because there's a lot of repetition, there's rhyme, and there's that rhythm of your native language. And all of these support what I look at when I analyze someone's speech and language skills, right? Their auditory processing. They're going to hear it over and over and over again. You know, think of row, row, row your boat, or twinkle, twinkle, little star, right? But it's also building what we call phonological awareness. And as I said earlier, a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound that can change the meaning. And so let me give you an example of that. So and put this in the context of rhyming, right? Think of Dr. Seuss. But when I say mat, cat, right? So the a part or at part stays the same, the root of the word. And we only change that very first sound, the and the k, right? That phoneme that changes. And when we sing a lot of nursery rhymes or we read a lot of rhyming books like Dr. Seuss, that's just the best example, we're building in what we call the phonological awareness. Again, your 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, even your 7-year-old isn't going to be able to explain to you what rhyming is, but they'll know it when they hear it. Right? Because they've had enough auditory practice to literally strengthen that skill, that auditory processing skill for phonemes. So phonological awareness is not phonics. Rhyming isn't phonics. Phonics is when you move into the letters, those black squiggly lines, right? But it's exercising literally what I call an auditory space when we sing row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, hundreds and hundreds of times, or any nursery rhyme. And again, this is true across cultures. And then nursery rhymes also build the vocabulary because they're typically around things that are important to them that are in context. It also nursery rhymes build predictive skills so they can anticipate what's going to come next. So once you've heard this song 3, 4, 5, 600 times, but you can say, row, row, row your boat gently down and they can anticipate, they can predict what, even if they say eam. So they've gotten the most critical elements to the word stream, but STR is going to be hard for, an 18-month-old or a 2-year-old to say. But they've gotten the rhythm They've had the auditory practice. They're phonologically aware of some of the sounds, right? And now they're predicting and anticipating what comes next in that rhyme. And again, this is cultural across the board. Look at Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star in English. You can look at Farajaka. You can look at even Nani Nani, which is a lullaby in Arabic. They're very structurally the same. So now the third element to nursery rhymes and what's happening in this first 6 to 12 months is that they begin to connect sound, all this noise making, to meaning. If you think back those first 3 months, it was just vocal play. It was building that relationship, right? It was connecting, taking turns, sharing, imitating, right? And now we're building enough sound within structures that are following words and sentence structure rules, right? That they're beginning auditorily to understand, oh, certain things mean certain things. Like this is glasses. This is, a little bitey toy or whatever you want to call it, or a book or a bottle or a shoe, right? They're beginning to make sense of these auditory patterns. And then that helps your baby really tune in and listen for what is important for us, those word boundaries, right? They begin to understand where one word ends and the next word begins, that there's structure, that it's not just, even with fast talkers, there's still boundaries into the word structures, right? They're also tuning into those intonation patterns, right? As well as emotional tones. And they can understand when something's getting excited and when something's scary or dark or I'm not sure, right? So there's a emotion that goes with the rhythm and the pitch and the tone, especially all of those nonverbal elements that I mentioned. But it's important that, again, that we're not just looking at some of these quote unquote baby elements as a cute little stage, right? That they're really, for centuries now, centuries upon centuries, have been used to help build and get your child to be competent by their second birthday, right? I mean, by their third birthday, they typically can have a full-fledged conversation with you. But by their second birthday, they can tell you what's the matter. They can share something exciting. They can be really creative with both verbal and gestural and acting out and miming and all of this, but they really are building that foundation to communicating and sharing. But the rhymes in nursery rhymes and in books really feed that, right? And as I said, the fourth element is that it really is supportive of cultural identity, right? Because it's true for all languages, right? And it really helps that social connection. And I've shared this before that I used to go and consult and advise a lot of different preschool settings. And sometimes it's organized chaos, right? Especially if I enter in the beginning of the day and kids are trying to settle in and they're waiting for everybody and they're trying to maybe sit down in circle time, and which is a whole nother conversation, but it's inappropriate, I think, for most preschool and especially toddlers. But I can go in there and get complete command of the whole environment just by simply singing a nursery rhymes. And usually it's Ring Around the Rosie because everybody's familiar with it. It's really, really simple. There's motor planning. It's connection, right? We all hold our hands. We slowly go around the circle. It's highly repetitive. And every child, the verbal kid, the not so verbal kid, the big kid, the little kid, they all jump in. They all know, right? It's part of our culture, part of that social connection. So it's important, again, when you do these things, don't just think, it's just for fun, or it is for fun. I mean, the truth is it should be for fun, right? And we should enjoy this time together, right? But because they're part of our culture, they're part of our childhood, it should reinforce that pleasure feeling, right? And that know that they're being passed on. And I'm afraid a lot of parents aren't going there anymore for lots of reasons. But I want to bring it back to that, because it's not just part of our culture and our generation, but which I think is important, but it really gives you a tool that can reinforce and encourage is the primary word there, that face-to-face connection. That one of the most potent drivers of early brain development is connection, right? Is spending time and doing it with them. And I think I'm afraid that a lot of us are losing that. And if we don't understand that it's not just for the heck of it or because it's cute, that it's really literally growing the brain and connecting those neurons and building neural pathways at the same time supporting their native language, right? And, there's meaning to it because, as I said, it goes across every continent, right? And that you're going to find parents using some form of rhyme and rhythm and song and repetition to help their little one, not just entertain them, but we're really, really giving exercise to the auditory, to the verbal, right, to the motor planning and wiring the brain. So just think about that, whether it's a little lullaby or a chant or a bouncing or just whatever you're doing, you turn it into song that will bring them into whatever the context is and help them attend. So let me address something that I think often comes up as a comment or a question. And I've mentioned it here before, but I think it's really important that we're always looking at some of the misunderstanding out there, right? So someone might say, oh, my brother, my uncle, my sister, he didn't talk until, she was 3. And now she has a master's degree, or now he runs a large company. I hear that probably at every one of my presentations, right? And I get why people say that. I think we say that to reassure ourselves, to reassure somebody else if we're talking about specifics. But in my 35 plus years of clinical practice, I have yet to meet a child who truly had no words. I'm not quite sure whether they had the cooing and the babbling and if it was differentiated babbling, but quite often you can see a very noisy toddler and it takes them a little extra long to get their sounds in an organized fashion, and then they're understood. But rarely is it that they're not practicing, right, with that cooing and babbling. Whoops, sorry. And then they just start talking, especially in full sentences. So I just want to put a little asterisk there. I think most of the time, we miss some of those soft signs early on with the cooing and the babbling, and how much babbling and how differentiated is it. And I think that there's another piece to that quite often, yes, about 1/3 of kids who are late talkers will catch up on their own by the time they enter kindergarten. And that statistic has been relatively sound my whole career. I don't know if that's true today, if the data will reflect that in the next 5 to 10 years, because I do think since the whole COVID pandemic lockdown and all of that, things have shifted and not for the better. But I think it's important that we also recognize that if a child does, quote unquote, catch up on their own by the time they enter kindergarten, they're still in a risk group because many of those kids will look okay on paper when they're 5 or 6, but they continue to lag behind. And so the gaps can then become wider and wider as they move into more academic and literacy type expectations, right? I think the important piece is that we have so much more information now that Dr. Cool's work and her colleagues, because there are other people in the field as well, really have embraced this study, right? And that technology has allowed us that we can understand what's going on so much more today than we could even 20 years ago or 30 years ago, right? And so my point here is that I never ever want to panic my listeners, right? I want you to think of all of this information as how can I be proactive? How can I sift through a lot of this information and understand how to support my little one through each and every phase, right? That language delays are so much easier, speech and language delays, or any developmental delay, they're so much easier to address early on. And I know that you know this in your head, but I spent most of my career helping kids on the other side. They've already kind of fallen off the cliff, right? And we're jumping in downstream, trying to put life jackets on them and, give them a buoy to support them and help compensate for some of the deficits that they weren't able to really close on their own. And so it's just so much easier to help the kids who are teetering, right, when they're 1, 2, 3, than to see what happens when they're 5 or 6 and when they enter the academic arena. So that's just kind of my PSA on all of this. Lately I've been looking at, how can I help you really understand that we want to reduce the risks and not roll the dice, right? That you, mom, dad, grandparents are really in the driver's seat. And that based on your daily choices, some of them big, some of them small, you can really move that needle and keep your child moving forward. Not in a perfect linear fashion, right? But there's going to be dips, but we're always moving forward. And that's what development is really all about. And 2, 3, 4, 5 steps forward, maybe 1 back. At this stage, let's take a look at what does this mean for you as a parent. And you can look at the cooing phase. You can look at the babbling phase. You can see for the next 6 months, from 12 months to 18 months, are they acquiring new words? And basically, why is it important that you want your baby and your toddler to be noisy and chatty? That when they're young, you want as much grunting and growling and squealing and chatter and noise, right? So we don't want to shush them. We want to encourage them. And sometimes when they're just making noises by themselves, leave them be, right? But when you're in it with them, be present, because knowing that the more sounds they're making, they're really experimenting, right? And we want them to move toward a handful of vowel sounds at 3 months of age to dozens of sounds by their first birthday, to mastering all 44 sounds by their second birthday, right? And you want them to keep exploring that. As I said, you are in the driver's seat, right? You're your baby's first conversational partner when you coo and ah and e and glee together. So if you're responsive, they're going to be responsive. If you mirror them, they will begin to mirror you. It's both the verbal and the nonverbal, from the smiles to just changing your lips and your jaw, closing your eyes, opening your eyes, banging on the table. All of that is getting them to understand they need to be an active partner too. That it's a two-way street, this whole conversational flow, right? And that they listen, and they share, and they listen, they think about it, they change, right? And it's really about connection, right? That speech isn't just about the words, isn't just about the sounds, right? But it's really about connecting and sharing your thoughts and your feelings, or expanding by asking questions. And so you're going to get mixed advice about, oh, you talk to your baby all day long. Talk a lot, especially when you're together, right? If you're changing them, or if you're sitting him in the high chair and you're sharing his first introductions to solids, those 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 months, share the meals with him and talk to him. Putting him in the car seat, talk to them. Take the phone, put it in your purse. Be present, right? Narrate, you hear that a lot, what you're doing. But it doesn't mean that you simply talk like you're reading an encyclopedia, right? That there needs to be purpose to it. That you're hoping to connect these words that are coming out of your mouth with the immediate environment. Like if you're washing your hands, or if you're sharing a sweet potato, right? Or if you're putting on your shoes. It doesn't have to be, let's sit down on the floor and play with these trucks or these dollies or this, whatever, cooking tools. It is using spoken language to build their attention, their interest, their curiosity. And so just describe things. Make up songs. I was notorious for making up songs. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Go back and say, they are citizens of the world. So they need to prune away what will not serve them. All of this engagement is building your baby's receptive language, right? And receptive is how well they understand. And that's long before they actually speak their first true words. But at the same time, they need that oral motor. They need to figure out, how do I control this airflow, inhalation, exhalation, phonation? How do I make different sounds on purpose? So let's just expand a little bit and put these 3 pieces together, right, for this mini series, looking at motor movement, looking at what are these milestones suggesting to us, and then looking at speech. Tummy time, that then leads into crawling, that then leads into chewing and eating, and how they all fit together. And like I said in episode 2, that tummy time isn't just about building the core strength, right? It's about building that stability and being able to then move smaller parts of the body. It's also not just about preventing a flat head, because we've placed our babies on our backs all the time. It's about being able to strengthen their fine motor movements, so it then supports eating and talking and attention and memory and all of these other higher order things. We see kids that have skipped a lot of these early developmental steps, milestones, phases, whatever you want to call them, and they're in different risk groups, right? But it makes sense if we have good neck and jaw and shoulder stability, then they're going to be able to sit in the high chair. And they're more relaxed in their body, and they can practice biting and chewing and swallowing. And if you strengthen the same motor planning or motor skills for oral motor planning, then babbling and talking, they're all developing at the same time, right? You look at 4 months and 5 months and 6 months and 7 months and 8 months. That span in particular is really, you can kind of think of it as the seed is breaking through the soil, right? And that so much has happened under the soil, and now it's really taking root. So all of the movement is critical for breast support and articulation, like I've said. All of this is not coincidental. The oral motor exploration with objects, and hopefully they're just playful objects that they can safely or their own body parts, right? But they're exploring that with food and with toy objects because that's what the oral cavity is giving them. But at the same time, is prepping them all of those experiences on their tummy and crawling and pulling to stand. It's helping wire the brain so they can do fine motor and gross motor skills together. So think of this first year, especially this first 6, 8, 10 months as a pre-game, right? And helping them move toward good eating habits and then good speech. And it's never just about the nutrition, and it's never just about, getting him to walk, right? It's about, like I've mentioned in the previous 2 episodes in this mini series, it's about the progressive steps that are wiring the brain, connecting the brain and the body, and then the body and the brain can connect to this 3-dimensional world. And it's really helping them build it from the inside out and the outside in. And that's why as we move forward, I'm going to speak more clearly and specifically on why screen time, especially in these first 2, 3, 4 years, is really, really a slippery slope. And if you listen to my reasoning behind movement and speech and play and sharing, it's in this 3-dimensional world with another human being. So this is how all of these things go together. Introducing solids, encouraging them to get on their belly and use all 4 limbs and to, move across the floor through motor play. And there's motor play in introducing solid foods as well as their toys, like I said. So all of these are coming together at the same time. And it's not a coincidence. I like to look at it as this is the magic piece that pulls all of this together, is that engagement, that being in it with them. And I'm not saying 24/7 and giving it all, but I'm saying that you snatch these moments, especially as you're introducing something new. Like you're moving them from the bath to putting your clothes on, right? Or you're moving them from the high chair and you're wiping their face. In those intimate moments, that engagement, that connection is really helping them learn that communication isn't in isolation. It's not about naming things. Oh, what's this? What's this? What's this? What's that? It's really about connecting with other people with intention, and that you're sharing these experiences through positive eye contact and giggles and facial expressions and imitation, and all of this is what they coined as serve and return, right? It's that tennis term, and it's really helping them feel connected, wire their brain, and understand how they're supposed to act or be or engage with this world, with the people that love him and take care of them, and with themselves. How can I sit down and play with this puzzle and entertain myself, because I've had enough of the grown-ups in my world that I'm not so needy on them. But part of this is also giving them that white space, right? So you can say something to them and then wait, right? Or if you first put them on the floor and they're interested in something, then let them be, right? Let them reach out for that toy, or see if they can organize their body and move toward it on their own. And you're there quietly. And if they get frustrated or if they look back at you, then you can encourage them. So there is an art and science to this whole parenting thing, and that it's really helping them through the minutia, right? And helping them connect those smaller elements. So then you're beginning to see the whole picture. And so just to kind of put this all together, or connect all of the dots, let's think of what cognitive skills, these movement skills, and then you have your speech and language. They're not developed on these separate tracks. And that's where I think these developmental charts can get us stuck, because we're compartmentalizing everything. But they're really woven together, and they rely on one another to build. Remember, cognition isn't intelligence, but it's in their understanding of their environment, their understanding of how they can interface with their environment and learn or grow or build or create or just enjoy, right? But when your baby reaches for something, or rolls, or begins to crawl and pull to a stand, they're building those brain pathways that support attention and focus and listening and memory. And when they play with their voice, they're developing that fine motor control that they need for speech and articulation, that then physically supports what they're thinking or what they're going to problem solve, right? And in the last episode, when I talked about the gross motor, right, the big muscles, when we lock eyes with each other, right? Your baby, your toddler. When we smile, we're forming that social emotional bond, right? To motivate them to communicate verbally and non-verbally. And the gross motor helps support all of that fine motor. And so, like I've referenced in future episodes, very near future, next month actually, I will explore very specific questions around screen time and what the research is saying, what us specialists are saying. And I want you to be able to overlay that on all of this important developmental information that you're listening to and kind of sorting through, right? But screen times, and this is a new phenomenon for us, right? The quote unquote smartphone was invented in 2006, right? And we had things leading up to this, right? We can look at that historical, but even in small doses, it really can interrupt this natural rhythm and dull their instinct that they're born with, right? That babies want to connect. They want to engage with other humans, right? They want to communicate, whether it's through cooing or babbling or reaching and grabbing or snuggling. All we're wired. And, again, God was brilliant to give us reflexes in the beginning, and then we reinforce those reflexes and we build a relationship with one another within the, first couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of months, right? But for now, I want you to really try to contemplate that it's your face, your voice, your responses to your baby and your toddler and your preschooler in real time that are the most important learning tools. And I think this is true for most of his or her childhood, that the screen is flat, there's no depth, it's not in sync with me, it can't give me any nuances, it's overstimulating, and we're going to talk about that, the pros and the cons, and what the evidence is suggesting. And then I want you to be an informed parent, right? To be proactive, to think about how I can navigate around this. But I wanted to kind of walk through these milestones as a multi-layered process. And I want you to think, when you hear that term milestones, think of them as like little signals, right? That help you navigate of what's working, what's not working, what might need support, right? And how can I encourage that? How are they linking up together, right? Maybe, he's not tolerating the high chair very well, which then makes him disengaged and fussy around food because they haven't spent a lot of time on the floor, whether it's through tummy time or crawling. Maybe we need to back up a little bit and spend more time on the floor to build strength and comfortableness, right? If we're strong in our body and we can sit here comfortably, then I can have a conversation with you, or I can relax my gross motor skills and just reach for something that looks interesting and explore it in my face, or in my mouth, not knowing, this is food. What's food, right? I've only had a breast or a bottle up to this point, right? But I want you to understand that these milestones are really, like I said, just a gauge. And hopefully you can use them to start a conversation with pediatrician or another developmental specialist, right? But trust your gut. If something feels off, 9 times out of 10, you're right. And if you feel like anybody is dismissing you, don't wait and see. Keep asking questions. Keep going back and spending more time with your little one and building your understanding of how are all these dots being connected, right? Because like I've always said, or I've said here today and in other episodes, that if you're informed, then you can be proactive. And that's our goal here, is to stay ahead of the whole developmental process and to know that you can avoid a lot of delay, a lot of developmental challenges that unfortunately we're trying to readjust to. And the goal isn't just, like I said earlier, checking the boxes, that we want to understand how they fit together. Because in the end, what's our big goal? To raise a child who is curious and connected and communicative, to raise a child who is eager and energetic and interested, right? And I want you to picture that they're not all going to grow up and be orators. That's not what I'm saying. And I've shared this with families over the years, but we want them to have the skill and the confidence to speak, to imagine, to share, right? We want that 3 and 4-year-old to be chatty and able to answer questions and ask questions and tell stories and learn how to relate to other kids. And we want them to almost drive us crazy, right? Silly, like I said, telling silly stories, asking 1,000 questions, eager to look at books and figure that what's going on the page, right? And the truth is that child doesn't get there by accident. And And I get really uncomfortable when they say, oh, kids are resilient, kids will work it out, they'll figure it out. And that's true. Kids are resilient. We are tenacious in surviving, but we don't want our kids just to survive. We want our kids to reach their own individual full potential. Maybe they are creatives and they can build stuff or they can draw things, or they're athletic, or they sing, or maybe they are just oral communicators, right? But we want them to have plenty of skill so then their choices aren't ever limited, right? That they can continue to build upon this, because that's how we're designed too. God was pretty brilliant in saying, with enough practice in anything, we can get better. So know that first year is really laying those building blocks and making that foundation really solid through connection and movement and introduction to meal times and babbling and first words and nursery rhymes and nursery books. Lean into all of that, right? Be present. Encourage a noisy baby, a curious toddler, and recognize that you're shaping this beautiful toddler to be the best that he can be, that it's not just a baby and not just a toddler, and we need to get through these phases, that he really is a human being, learning how to communicate, how to relate with other human beings, how to build relationships, how to be socially mature, that social emotional stability. And no matter where you are on this journey, whether they're 6 months or 16 months or 26 months, you can always step back and look, where are they today? And how can I support them? Or how can I close up some of these gaps? And with that in mind, I want to remind you that May is Better Speech and Hearing Month for our national organization, which is American Speech and Hearing Association. As long as I can remember, May has always been Better Speech and Hearing Month. So I will be starting my small group coaching program, and it will kick off in the middle of May. If you've been feeling unsure or overwhelmed, or you just need a little bit more real-time support, then this group is for you. And we will go deeper. You will learn exactly how to guide your baby and your toddler's development at any phase between birth and 3 years of age. That's the one caveat there, right? I don't go into preschool age, but you'll have direct access with me. It'll be a small, high-touch coaching group, right? There'll be other moms that you'll also have a lot of access to that you all can share because you're in it together. And there's no perfect answers. I want us to be clear that with intentional small tweaks here and there, we will be able to make big change and big growth, right? So get on the wait list. There's a link down below in the show notes. You don't want to miss this chance to really find some clarity. I don't want you to get stuck in a catch-up mode. I want you to know and feel confident and really take full advantage so this summer can be the best summer ever. So keep talking, keep playing, and share those meals with each other. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care. Bye. God bless.